Calix Vaughn watched the coffee swirl in his cup like a miniature black hole, pulling in light, hope, and just about every ounce of energy he had left. It was either this or a swift kick to the rear by his boss, and frankly he wasn't sure which option was worse. The endurance hummed around him, its metal bowels clanking and groaning like an old man trying to get out of bed. It was home, sweet, dysfunctional home. "Hey, Vaughn," came the sharp bark that cut through his morning fog. He squinted up to find Dr. Lyra Halen, resident miracle worker and part-time shrink, hovering over him with a smirk that could slice through hull plating. Her eyebrows were arched in that way that suggested she knew something he didn't, which was often. "Morning, Doc," he grumbled, taking a sip of his glorified sludge. "What brings you to my humble corner of despair?" "Oh, just the usual," she replied, dropping into the chair opposite him. "Existential dread, shipwide hysteria, and the faint aroma of mutiny. You know, Tuesday things." Calix chuckled dryly, nursing his coffee as if it were life support. "Sounds like my type of chaos. What's the latest?" Lyra leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You heard about the Ithrix, right? Aliens with a penchant for turning people into emotional puddles. Yeah, they came up in last week's meeting right between recycling protocols and who ate my sandwich. Well, turns out they might be doing more than just giving us the warm fuzzes. We've got a spike in altercations on board. Petty stuff mostly, but it's adding up." Calix rubbed his chin thoughtfully, or at least that's what it looked like. In reality, he was trying to remember if he'd taken his migraine meds. "So you think these extraterrestrial busybodies are messing with our heads?" "Messing is one word for it," Lyra said, eyes scanning the room as if expecting a Ithrix to pop out from behind the sandwich counter. "Empathy's a weapon when wielded right. They could be stirring the pot just enough to keep us off balance." "Great," Calix sighed, eyes rolling. "It's not enough that they're more advanced, they also have to be sentimentally superior." "Superior?" "No," Lyra corrected him with a wink. "Just more annoying." Calix set his mug down with a clatter, the noise echoing his own frustration. "And let me guess, it's up to us to figure out how to stop them from turning endurance into a floating soap opera." "Bingo," Lyra said, pointing an imaginary gun at him and pulling the trigger. "You'll love this part. Commands on our case to investigate and mitigate." "Investigate and mitigate, huh? How corporate of them," Calix deadpanned. "So what's the plan?" "Interrogate everyone until they admit they're feeling a little too happy today." "If only," Lyra chuckled. "No, we're looking for patterns, triggers, anything that hints at manipulation." "Patterns," Calix repeated, sounding about as enthused as a guy reading the fine print of a nuclear warranty. "All right, I suppose I can squeeze in some amateur detective work between my regular sessions of wondering what I did wrong with my life." Lyra stood, patting his shoulder with mock sympathy. "You're a trooper, Calix, and who knows, maybe you'll get a free therapy session out of this." "Yeah, that'll be the day," he muttered as she walked off, leaving him to his thoughts and the dregs of his coffee. Later, as Calix trudged through the labyrinth of corridors that made up the Endurance, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia if they really were out to get you, right? The ship's lighting flickered ominously, a testament to budget cuts and a maintenance crew more interested in their poker games than fixing wiring. He was on his way to the bridge when he bumped into one of the newer crew members, a kid named Jax who looked like he'd been born holding a VR headset. Jax had that jittery energy of someone who'd had too much caffeine or was about to confess a murder. "Calix," Jax blurted, nearly bouncing off the walls. "Hey, you hear anything about?" "You know the weird stuff going on." "Define weird," Calix replied, arching an eyebrow. "This place is a circus on a good day." "Well, like people acting strange more than usual," Jax insisted, waving his hands around like he was putting out invisible fires. "I heard some folks definitely aren't themselves." "In this tin can, that's a feature, not a bug," Calix said dryly. "But yeah, we've got eyes on it." Jax nodded, looking both relieved and anxious, a combination Calix had only ever seen on first-time fathers and interns. "So, you think it's safe?" "Safe," Calyx echoed, giving a short laugh. On the Endurance, kid, nothing's safe. Not the food, not the air, and certainly not the people. Jax paled slightly, which was impressive given the ship's fluorescent lighting. Right, I'll keep that in mind. Calyx patted him on the shoulder, feeling briefly like a mentor before shaking it off. You do that, he said before heading off, leaving Jax to his conspiracies. The bridge of the Endurance was a place where hope went to die. At least, that's what Calyx thought every time he stepped through the doors. The room was filled with screens showing the vast nothingness of space, as if anyone needed reminding of just how far from home they really were. Captain Darrow stood at the helm, his posture as stiff as the regulations he loved to quote. Vaughn, he acknowledged, not bothering to look up from his display. Captain, Calyx replied, strolling over with all the enthusiasm of a man headed to the gallows. Heard you wanted to see me. Darrow turned, finally deigning to give Calyx his attention. We've got a problem, he said, as if stating the obvious was a special talent. Tensions are rising, altercations are becoming regular. Yeah, been briefed, Calyx said, crossing his arms. Doc Halen thinks the Ithrix might be pulling our strings. Darrow's eyes narrowed like a hawk sizing up a particularly irritating mouse. Do you agree? Do I care? That's the better question, Calyx retorted before shrugging. But yeah, it's possible. The captain nodded, his expression unreadable. Then we need solutions, not just observations. Got it, Calyx said, turning to leave. I'll whip up a miracle right after breakfast. See that you do, Darrow called after him, though Calyx was already halfway out the door, the captain's words rolling off his back like water off a duck. Back in his quarters, which were slightly larger than a closet and about as comfortable, Calyx sat on his bunk and considered his options. It was like trying to pick a path in an asteroid field. Choose wrong and you get smashed to bits. The Ithrix were an elegant, enigmatic pain in humanity's collective backside. They could sway the emotions of a room with little more than a thought and had been a thorn in Earth's side ever since contact was established. If they were behind the unrest on the Endurance, it'd be like them, subtle and infuriating. He glanced at the ceiling, hoping for divine inspiration, but all he got was a dust bunny gently floating by. Right, he muttered to himself, guess it's up to me. Calyx pulled out his datapad, running through the reports trying to find a pattern in the chaos. Hours passed, marked only by the occasional ship-wide announcement and the rumbling of his stomach. He was knee-deep in conspiracy theories about alien empathy and wondering if he'd lost the plot entirely when Lyra popped back in, looking way too perky for the time of day. How's the investigation going? She asked, leaning against the door frame, arms crossed. Like a blind man at a dartboard, Calyx replied, rubbing his eyes. Lots of effort, not much hitting the mark. She nodded sympathetically, then tossed him a protein bar. Here, brain food. Thanks, he said, tearing it open and taking a bite that tasted like cardboard's less exciting cousin. Any new insights from the land of feelings? Not much, Lyra admitted. But I did hear something interesting from one of my patients. They've been having vivid dreams, like memories that aren't theirs. Calyx paused mid-chew. You think the Ithrix are playing dream weavers now? If they are that invested in our headspace, it's a possibility, she replied, shrugging. Maybe they're planting seeds. Great, Calyx said, throwing the bar wrapper into the nearest recycler. As if we needed more help screwing things up, Lyra laughed, the sound bright against the gloom of the room. You always know how to look on the bright side. It's a gift, he said, standing up and stretching. All right, guess we keep digging. Maybe there's a clue in these dreams, some thread we can pull. Sounds like a plan, Lyra agreed, straightening up. And hey, if we pull hard enough, we might just unravel the whole mess. Calyx smiled, feeling the smallest glimmer of hope. Or we might hang ourselves with the thread. Lyra grinned back, giving him a mock salute. That's the spirit. As she left, Calyx felt the weight of the ship around him, the endless miles of metal and circuitry that kept them all alive and trapped. The Endurance was a floating city of misfit toys, bound by duty and desperation. And somewhere out there, The Ithrics were watching, waiting, and pulling strings. But then, that was just another day in paradise, wasn't it? As he picked up his datapad again, Calyx couldn't help but think that if they weren't the masters of their own fate, they'd damn well fake it till they made it, or die trying. Calyx Vaughn was elbow-deep in what he liked to call disaster prep, reading all the reports about the Ithrics and their possible mind games when Lyra came knocking. Apparently, she had dragged him to yet another council meeting, as if he hadn't suffered enough already. It was a miracle they hadn't turned these gatherings into a reality TV show. Survivor. Endurance. Calyx had just enough time to grab his datapad and make a mental note to avoid speaking his mind too openly. The last time he'd done that, Captain Darrow had given him a glare cold enough to freeze the engine coolant. The council meeting was being held in the ship's cramped conference room, which was about as cheerful as a dentist's office. The flickering lights added a nice touch to the ambience, like they were all part of a horror movie just waiting for the monster to jump out. Lyra was already there, absorbed in her own datapad. "Ready for another round of guess the alien's motive?" she asked, her voice a mix of sarcasm and genuine curiosity. "Is it ever too late to plead insanity?" Calyx replied, sliding into the empty seat next to her. The room was filling up with the usual suspects: Captain Darrow, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else; Lieutenant Firth, who could probably find a way to make ice cream sound boring; and a smattering of other officers, all wearing expressions that ranged from annoyed to outright hostile. "We'll get started," Darrow announced, tapping the table to get everyone's attention. "We're here to discuss the escalating tensions and the potential link to the Ithrics." Firth cleared his throat, a sound like a dying engine. "We've received reports of unusual emotional fluctuations among the crew consistent with Ithrics interference." Calyx stifled a yawn. "Unusual fluctuations? What, people are actually starting to smile?" Lyra smirked. "More like starting fights over who gets the last cup of coffee. Serious matters require serious discussions," Darrow cut in, eyeing Calyx like a schoolteacher with a particularly troublesome student. "Our goal is to determine whether these incidents are isolated or part of a larger pattern." "Yeah, about that pattern," Calyx said, raising a hand like he was back in grade school. "If the Ithrics are behind this, what's their endgame? Turn us all into reality TV stars?" Firth didn't even crack a smile. "Perhaps they're testing the limits of human resilience." Calyx snorted. "Or just bored and need a new soap opera," Lyra chimed in. "Has anyone considered the possibility that they're trying to instigate a mutiny?" A ripple of unease spread across the room, as if she'd suggested they all start tap dancing in Eva suits. Darrow leaned forward, hands steepled like he was some villain from a cheap holo-vid. "A mutiny would be catastrophic." "No kidding," Calyx muttered. "And here I was thinking it might be good for morale." "We need evidence," Firth insisted, displaying his stunning grasp of the obvious. "Without it, we're just chasing shadows. And what a fun chase it is," Calyx deadpanned, glancing at Lyra. "So, what's our next move, fearless leader?" "Observe, gather data, and try not to let paranoia turn us into our own worst enemies," Lyra replied, scanning the room as if daring someone to argue. The meeting dragged on, filled with more questions than answers. Calyx found himself zoning out, imagining the Ithrics sitting around their alien equivalent of a campfire, laughing their tentacles off at the mess they'd created. Eventually, the meeting broke up, with the officers dispersing like disgruntled cats. Calyx lingered, catching up with Lyra as they headed back out into the corridor. "Well, that was enlightening," he said. "I feel like we've really got a handle on things now." Lyra sighed, rubbing her temples. "We've got a handle on Jack Squat, and you know it." "Yeah, but it sounds better the other way," he replied, grinning. As they navigated the ship's labyrinthine corridors, Calyx couldn't help but notice the tense atmosphere. People were stiff, eyes darting around like they expected something to explode, never the best sign on a spaceship. Calyx and Lyra found themselves stopping by the mess hall, mostly because neither of them could face another minute of gloom and doom without some form of sustenance. The place was buzzing with crew members, all of whom had apparently decided that eating was the only thing they could control. The noise level was somewhere between concert and drunken brawl. They grabbed trays and joined the line, hoping that today's mystery meat was at least vaguely edible. As the line shuffled forward, Calyx noticed Jack sitting at a table by himself, looking like a puppy someone had kicked one too many times. "Mind if we join you?" Calyx asked, not waiting for an answer before sitting down. Lyra followed suit, giving Jax a reassuring smile. Sure," Jack stammered, poking at his food like it might bite back. "You think they know what's going on?" Calyx shrugged. "They think they know. Whether or not they're right is another story." Lyra leaned forward, her voice low. "Stay alert, Jax. If you notice anything strange, report it. Even if it seems minor." Jax nodded, looking slightly less like a deer caught in headlights. "I will, thanks." As they ate, Calyx couldn't shake the feeling that the Ithrix were playing them like marionettes, each string carefully yanked to provoke a reaction. It was the kind of situation that made him wish for a nice, simple crisis, like a hull breach. The day dragged on, with Calyx going through the motions of his duties, his mind a whirl of suspicions and half-baked theories. He caught snippets of conversations in the hallways, crew members whispering about incidents that seemed too coincidental to ignore. Back in his quarters, Calyx sprawled on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the ship was a constant reminder of the fragile metal shell that separated them from the void. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, like a ticking clock that no one could quite hear. The next morning found Calyx and Lyra summoned to yet another meeting, this one smaller and more tense. A select group of officers and specialists gathered to try and piece together the jigsaw puzzle of alien meddling. Darrow was there, along with Firth and a few others, all wearing expressions that suggested they'd rather be undergoing dental surgery without anesthesia. "We've gathered some new intelligence," Darrow began, gesturing to the holographic display in the center of the table. "Recent incidents have been linked to specific crew members, and there appears to be a pattern." Lyra leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of pattern?" Firth tapped a few buttons, bringing up a list of names. "These individuals have been involved in multiple altercations or reported significant emotional shifts." Calyx scanned the list, recognizing a few names. "So, what?" "These folks are more susceptible to Ithrix influence." "That's one possibility," Firth replied, his tone as bland as his personality. "Another is that they are being targeted deliberately." "Great," Calyx said, crossing his arms. "So we're dealing with alien bullies picking on the weak." Lyra was studying the data, a frown creasing her forehead. "Has anyone talked to them?" "Tried to find out what they're experiencing," Darrow nodded. "We've interviewed several, but their accounts are fragmented, inconsistent. It's unclear if they are recalling their own experiences or something else entirely." "Memories that aren't theirs," Calyx said, recalling their earlier conversation. "If the Ithrix are implanting false memories, then we're in deep," Lyra finished, looking grim. The meeting continued, filled with theories and counter-theories, all underpinned by the cold, hard fact that they still didn't know jack about what the Ithrix really wanted. As the others debated, Calyx felt a growing sense of futility. They were like rats in a maze, chasing illusions and shadows. Finally, the meeting adjourned, leaving Calyx and Lyra to wander the corridors once more. They passed crew members, each one a potential puppet in the Ithrix's grand theater. "What's our next move?" Lyra asked, her voice quiet in the echoing hallway. Calyx ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down. "Keep our eyes open, keep talking to people. Maybe we can spot something everyone else is missing." "Sounds like a plan," Lyra said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Calyx forced a smile. "Hey, if I wanted easy answers, I'd have taken that desk job back on Earth." They shared a laugh, the sound echoing down the corridor, a brief flicker of normality in the madness. But as they walked, Calyx couldn't shake the feeling that they were all teetering on the edge, a single push away from chaos. And if the Ithrics were indeed orchestrating this dance, then it was only a matter of time before the curtain fell. The Endurance groaned around them, its ancient metal bones creaking under the strain of space and the unseen forces pulling its strings. Calyx knew they had to find answers, and fast. Because in a universe where empathy was a weapon, ignorance was a death sentence. Calyx leaned back in his chair, staring at the holographic display in front of him. It flickered like a cheap motel sign, casting a sickly glow over the cramped room. Lyra was next to him, chewing on the end of a stylus like it was the only thing keeping her sane. "So what do we have?" Calyx asked, breaking the silence that had settled like a bad smell. Lyra sighed, scrolling through the data. "The Ithrics have been busy little bees. Looks like they've managed to worm their way into our communication systems." Calyx raised an eyebrow. "You mean they've hacked us? That's just perfect." "Next, they'll be sending us spam about intergalactic insurance." "Pretty much," Lyra replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Except they're more interested in tugging at our heartstrings than selling us useless junk." Emotional manipulation through the comms. Calyx shook his head, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. "Why not just send a singing telegram while they are at it?" Lyra chuckled. "I dunno, maybe they prefer their mind games delivered directly to our cerebellums." Calyx glanced around the room, the walls closing in like the world's worst hug. "All right, so how do we fix this mess?" "We need to isolate their access points and cut them off," Lyra explained, her fingers dancing over the keypad. "Problem is, every time we close one access point, they seem to find another. Persistent little buggers, aren't they?" Calyx quipped, though his mind was racing. "We might need a more creative approach." "Creative?" Lyra echoed, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You mean like rigging the system to blast bad 80s music at them every time they try to connect?" Calyx grinned. "Exactly. Let's see how they like being rickrolled." Their laughter was short-lived as the reality of the situation settled back in. The Ithrics had them on the ropes, and the crew was starting to crack under the pressure. Whispers of suspicion were spreading like a virus, turning friendly exchanges into tense standoffs. Calyx and Lyra made their way to the ship's nerve center, a room that was more cables and wires than actual space. It was cluttered with screens and buzzing with the constant hum of machinery, like an overcaffeinated beehive. Chief Engineer Rook was there, elbows deep in a panel that looked suspiciously like it might explode at any moment. "You two here to lend a hand or just get in my way?" "We're here to help," Lyra replied, though her expression suggested she might prefer a root canal. Calyx shot Rook a lopsided grin. "We hear you're having some technical difficulties." "Understatement of the century," Rook muttered, yanking on a stubborn wire. "The Ithrics have made a mess of things. I'm tempted to just scrap the whole system and start over." "Tempting, but probably not an option," Lyra said, examining the tangled mess. "What if we reroute the primary conduits? Force them to play whack-a-mole with our defenses?" Rook scratched his chin, smudging grease across his cheek. "Might just work, but it'd mean shutting down comms for a while." "Better than letting the alien boogeymen keep playing puppet master," Calyx pointed out. "All right," Rook conceded, nodding. "Let's give it a shot." As they worked, the tension in the room was palpable. Every twist of a wire, every flicker of a screen seemed to hold the fate of the crew in its hands. The ship groaned around them, as if it too was straining under the weight of the Ithrics' unseen manipulations. The Iors ticked by in a blur of repairs and recalibrations, each step forward feeling like a minor miracle. By the time they finished, Calyx felt as though he'd run a marathon with a sack of rocks on his back. "Think it'll hold?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Rook shrugged, a gesture that screamed pessimism. "Only one way to find out." "Great," Calyx said, clapping his hands together. "Let's see if our alien friends are as adaptable as they think." They reactivated the system, watching tensely as the comms flickered back to life. For a moment, everything seemed normal, the calm before the storm. Looks like it's holding, Lyra said, cautiously optimistic. Don't jinx it, Calyx cautioned, glancing at the monitors as if they might suddenly burst into flames. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. But slowly, as the system held steady, the atmosphere in the room began to relax. Even Rook managed a small smile, though it looked like it might crack his face in half. "All right," Rook said, clapping Calyx on the shoulder. "Not bad for day's work." Calyx grinned, though he knew better than to count his chickens. "Let's not break out the champagne just yet." "Yeah, I'll wait until we're not about to be used as emotional pinatas," Lyra added, crossing her arms. As they left the nerve center, Calyx couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. The Ithrix had been one step ahead all along, and he doubted they'd take this latest setback lying down. The corridors of the Endurance seemed more oppressive than usual, the shadows longer, the air thicker. Paranoia was a contagion, spreading through the ship like wildfire. Conversations were hushed, filled with sideways glances and subtle accusations. Calyx and Lyra found themselves in the mess hall once more, where the air was thick with tension. Jax was sitting at the same table as before, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. "Mind if we join you again?" Calyx asked, though it was more of a formality than an actual question. "Sure," Jax mumbled, not even looking up from his plate. "You doing all right?" Lyra asked, concern lacing her voice. Jax shrugged, his eyes fixed on his food. "Just trying to keep my head down, you know. Probably smart," Calyx said, digging into his own meal with little enthusiasm. "But let us know if you notice anything weird." "Everything's weird," Jax replied, finally meeting Calyx's gaze. "Feels like the whole ship's gone mad." Calyx nodded, the kernel of unease in his gut blossoming. "You're not wrong. But we're working on it." Their conversation drifted to safer topics, but the underlying tension remained, a reminder of the chaos simmering beneath the surface. As the day wore on, Calyx found himself back in his quarters, trying to unwind. But relaxation was an elusive beast, constantly slipping through his fingers. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how long before the Ithrix made their next move. His datapad beeped, a message flashing across the screen. The words were simple, yet loaded with implication. "We need to talk." Calyx recognized the sender, Captain Darrow. He sighed, pulling himself to his feet and heading for the captain's quarters. The door whooshed open, revealing Darrow standing by the viewport, staring out at the stars as if they held the answers. The room was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners like old regrets. "You called," Calyx said, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Darrow turned, his expression unreadable. "We have a problem." "Just one?" Calyx quipped, though he knew this was serious. The captain ignored the jibe, gesturing for Calyx to join him. "Reports are coming in. More incidents, more altercations. The crew's fraying at the edges." Calyx ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of Darrow's words. "You think the Ithrix are behind it?" "What else?" Darrow replied, his voice a low growl. "They're testing us, pushing to see where we'll break." "And are we?" Calyx asked, leaning against the glass, the cold seeping into his bones. Darrow was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the endless void. "Not yet. But we're close." Calyx nodded, the gravity of their situation sinking in. "So what's the plan?" "Keep doing what you're doing," Darrow said, his tone decisive. "Find out how they're getting to us and shut it down." "No pressure," Calyx muttered, though a part of him relished the challenge. As he left the captain's quarters, the enormity of their task loomed large. The Ithrix were masters of the unseen, manipulating emotions and sowing discord with an insidious finesse. It felt like fighting a ghost, every punch passing through empty air. Calyx met up with Lyra again, finding her in the lab, surrounded by a sea of datapads. She looked up as he entered, her expression a blend of fatigue and determination. "More bad news?" she asked, her tone resigned. "Is there any other kind?" Calyx replied, dropping into a chair opposite her. "Well, I've been going through the logs," Lyra said, gesturing to the chaotic pile of devices. "And I think I've found something." Calyx leaned forward, interest piqued. "Do tell." Lyra tapped a few buttons, bringing up a series of graphs and charts. There's a pattern to the incidents. They spike during specific communication windows. Like clockwork, Calyx murmured, studying the data. So they are timing their attacks. Exactly, Lyra confirmed. If we can anticipate their next window, we might be able to intercept their signal. A sense of hope stirred within Calyx, a rare and fragile thing. Then let's do it. They spent the next few hours devising a plan, analyzing every scrap of data they could find. As the ship's systems hummed around them, Calyx felt a sense of purpose. They were on the cusp of something, an opportunity to strike back. The hours ticked by, the ship's artificial day cycling into night. Finally, their preparations complete, Calyx and Lyra sat in silence, waiting for the Ithrix to make their move. When the appointed time arrived, they were ready. The comms crackled to life, the alien signal a discordant melody that reverberated through the ship. Calyx and Lyra sprang into action, their fingers flying across the controls, rerouting power and isolating the signal. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, with a triumphant cry, Lyra broke the silence. "Got it." Calyx watched as the alien signal fizzled out, cut off mid-sentence. A sense of victory surged through him, tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle in a larger war. "We did it," he said, allowing himself a rare smile. "For now," Lyra replied, though her eyes shone with determination. "But we'll be ready for whatever they throw at us next." As they sat together in the dimly lit lab, the ship around them groaning like an old man with stiff joints, Calyx felt the weight of their situation lift, if only a little. They were still in the thick of it, still fighting ghosts and shadows, but for the first time, it felt like they might just stand a chance. And in a universe as bleak as theirs, that was something worth holding onto. Calyx felt the weight of the universe on his shoulders, not the romanticized kind where you wear a cape and save the day, but the grim reality of knowing you're a few bad choices away from becoming space dust. He was back in the cramped room with Lyra, who was fiddling with something that looked suspiciously like a child's science fair project from hell. "Tell me that's the new psychological shield and not an improvised explosive device," Calyx said, raising an eyebrow. Lyra glanced up, her eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as manic brilliance. "Depends on your definition of explosion. Could blow your mind or save it." "I'll take the latter," he replied, watching her attach wires that looked more like spaghetti than serious tech. "What's the plan?" "Simple." Lyra brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, smudging grease on her forehead. "We create a barrier in the crew's minds. Think of it as an emotional firewall. Block the Ithrix from making us feel like we're on an intergalactic roller coaster without the fun parts." Calyx scratched his chin, dubious. "And how exactly do you install an emotional firewall?" "Ah, therein lies the beauty," she said, her grin widening like a cat with a particularly juicy canary. "We use the comm system to broadcast a counter-frequency that neutralizes their empathetic waves, so we're fighting vibes with vibes." Calyx deadpanned. "Sounds like the plot of a bad teen drama, or a winning episode of Galactic DIY, Lyra shot back. Calyx chuckled, despite himself. "All right, Dr. Halen. Let's hope your science experiment doesn't end with us all hallucinating rainbows and unicorns. Wouldn't that be a treat?" Lyra muttered, returning her attention to the mess of circuits and wires. Hours trickled by, each one etched with the suspense of impending doom. There was no denying it, the Ithrix had upped their game. Reports of altercations flooded in, the crew's nerves fraying like an old rope about to snap. Calyx couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the brink of chaos. The comms buzzed to life, the voice of Lieutenant Firth droning through the static like a funeral dirge. "Another incident on Deck 3. Temperatures are rising. Sounds like bath time in hell," Calyx muttered, adjusting his datapad. "How are we looking, Lyra?" "Almost there," she replied, her fingers a blur over the controls. "Just need to fine-tune the frequency." Calyx glanced at the flickering holographic display, half expecting it to start spouting poetry. And what happens if we get the frequency wrong? Lyra didn't look up. Either nothing happens, or everyone's mood flips faster than a politician's promises. Great. So, no pressure, Calyx said, sarcasm dripping like oil from a rusted pipe. Ready as we'll ever be, Lyra announced, finally stepping back from her creation with a flourish. Prepare for the psychological equivalent of a roundhouse kick. Calyx relayed the orders, the ship's intercom echoing his words like a prophet of doom. Attention all crew. Brace yourselves for the ride of your lives, or at least a slightly less miserable one. The system activated, a subtle hum vibrating through the walls. Calyx and Lyra watched the readings, tension coiling in the air like a spring. For a moment all seemed calm. Then the ship shuddered, a groan reverberating through its metal bones. Suddenly the air was thick with something intangible yet powerful, churning like a storm in a bottle. Hold on, Lyra said, her eyes fixed on the monitors. The storm hit, invisible but overwhelming. The Ithrix had unleashed a wave of empathy manipulation so intense it felt as though the ship itself might buckle under the strain. Crew members staggered, groaning as the alien influence seeped into their minds. Looks like they brought out the big guns, Calyx said, clinging to the console as if it were a lifeline. Lyra grimaced. Stay focused. The shield's holding, but it's a hell of a fight. The minutes stretched, every second a battle against an enemy they couldn't see. Calyx's heart pounded, adrenaline singing through his veins like a symphony of chaos. The crew's emotions swung wildly, from manic laughter to seething rage, the Ithrix's assault relentless. Calyx's calm beeped, Captain Darrow's voice cutting through the maelstrom. Vaughn, report. Just another day in paradise, Calyx replied, straining to keep his voice steady. We've got the shield up, but the Ithrix are throwing everything they've got at us. Keep it together, Darrow barked, his tone brooking no argument. We can't afford to lose control. Working on it, Calyx said, exchanging a glance with Lyra. Just try to keep the crew from killing each other. Easier said than done, Darrow replied, the line going dead with a click. This isn't going to hold forever, Lyra said, worry etching lines in her face. Then we make it hold, Calyx replied, determination hardening his voice. Increase the frequency, see if we can drown them out. Lyra nodded, adjusting the controls with a deft hand. The hum deepened, a resonant thrum that seemed to shake the very air. Come on, you bastard, Calyx whispered, willing the shield to hold. The ship trembled, the conflict reaching a fever pitch. Calyx felt the alien presence clawing at the edges of his mind, a dark tide threatening to swallow him whole. But slowly, imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. The crew's emotions steadied, the wild swing smoothing into something more manageable. The Ithrix's influence waned, their grip slipping inch by painstaking inch. We're doing it, Lyra said, her voice a mix of relief and disbelief. Calyx nodded, feeling the tide turn, for now. But don't get complacent. They'll be back and probably with a new trick up their sleeve. It's a start, Lyra replied, though her eyes were wary. The ship's system stabilized, the oppressive weight lifting like a morning fog. Calyx let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. Not bad for day's work, he said, collapsing into a chair. Lyra joined him, her expression a blend of triumph and fatigue. You think this'll buy us some peace? Calyx shrugged, the movement heavy with the burden of experience. In this line of work, peace is just the space between disasters. As they sat there, the quiet hum of the ship a soothing balm, Calyx couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. The Ithrix were cunning, their motives as inscrutable as the void itself. But for now, they'd secured a small victory, a flicker of hope in a universe that seemed determined to snuff it out. The datapad buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts like a splash of cold water. Another message from Darrow, terse and to the point. Debrief in 10. Looks like the fun never ends, Calyx said, pushing to his feet with a groan. Lyra smirked, though the weariness in her eyes betrayed her. Wouldn't want it any other way, right? Speak for yourself, Calyx muttered, though a part of him couldn't deny the thrill of the challenge. They made their way to the conference room. the ship's corridors feeling a touch less oppressive now that the storm had passed. The shadows were still there, of course, lurking like unwelcome guests, but for now, they were content to merely watch. The conference room was as inviting as a grave, its sterile atmosphere a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just faced. Captain Darrow was already there, his expression as inscrutable as ever, with Lieutenant Firth hovering nearby like a loyal but slightly confused dog. Von Halen Darrow greeted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Sit." They complied, sinking into chairs that felt like they were made of concrete. "Good work today," Darrow said, his gaze settling on Calyx. "But we're not out of the woods yet." "No surprise there," Calyx replied, crossing his arms. "The Ithrics aren't the type to give up easily, which is why we need to be ready for their next move," Darrow continued, his tone brooking no nonsense. "Halen, your shield seems to be holding for now, but we need a long-term solution." Lyra nodded, though her expression was contemplative. "I'll keep refining the frequency, see if we can make it more resilient." "Do that," Darrow said, turning his attention back to Calyx. "And Vaughn, keep the crew in line. We can't afford any more incidents." "I'll do my best," Calyx promised, though he knew it was a tall order. "Dismissed," Darrow said, turning back to the viewport, his silhouette outlined against the vastness of space. Calyx and Lyra left the conference room, the weight of their responsibilities pressing down like an invisible hand. Their victory felt fragile, the peace they'd won as fleeting as a breath. Back in their cramped quarters, Calyx collapsed onto his bunk, feeling every ache and bruise as though he'd gone a few rounds with a prizefighter. Lyra settled across from him, fiddling with a datapad, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Think we'll ever get used to this?" Calyx asked, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer answers. "Doubt it," Lyra replied, her tone wry. "But at least we're getting good at improvising." Calyx chuckled, a dry, weary sound that echoed in the small room. "Here's to living on the edge." Their laughter faded, leaving behind a comfortable silence, broken only by the steady hum of the ship. It wasn't peace, not really, but it was close enough for now. As Calyx drifted towards sleep, the weight of the day settling over him like a heavy blanket, he allowed himself a small slice of hope. The Ithrics might be clever, their tricks a constant thorn in the ship's side, but he and Lyra were just as stubborn, just as determined. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't much. But in a world where the odds were stacked against them, it was enough to keep fighting. And for now, that would have to be enough. Calyx Vaughn sat in his bunk, feeling like a condemned man awaiting execution. The weight of the universe pressed down on him, each breath a struggle against the invisible hand squeezing his chest. In the dim light of their cramped quarters, Lyra Halen tinkered with her datapad, the glow casting her face in sharp relief. "Ever feel like we're the only sane ones left on this ship?" Calyx asked, staring at the ceiling like it might crack open and swallow him whole. Lyra didn't look up. "Sane, maybe. But sane on the Endurance is just a hair's breadth from batshit crazy." He chuckled, though it came out more like a sigh. "Given the choice, I'd take mildly deranged over what the rest of the crew's dealing with." The Ithrics' latest emotional salvo had left them reeling, the crew's emotional state swinging from murderous rage to gut-wrenching despair with all the grace of a drunk in zero-G. And now the latest reports hinted at something worse. Sabotage from within. "Sabotage," Calyx muttered, "the gift that keeps on giving." Lyra finally glanced up, arching an eyebrow. "What's eating you now?" "Nothing much. Just the fact that someone on this ship is working with the Ithrics." He rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the headache threatening to explode behind his eyes. "Whoever it is, they're doing a damn good job of screwing us over," Lyra said, returning her attention to her datapad. "Comm systems are being compromised faster than we can lock them down." Calyx grimaced. "Sooner or later, we're going to have to root out the mole, preferably before they turn us all into space dust." Lyra's fingers paused for just a moment. "Any brilliant ideas?" "None that don't involve a lot of violence and very little subtlety," Calyx admitted. "But until we figure out who's got a Ithrics puppet string up there, The door snapped open, cutting him off. Captain Darrow stood in the doorway, looking every bit like a man who just walked through hell and wasn't particularly impressed by it. "Von Halen, we need to talk," Darrow said, his voice as inviting as a sandpaper handshake. Calix exchanged a glance with Lyra. When Darrow said they needed to talk, it was never for a heart-to-heart. "Let me guess. Bad news," Darrow snorted. "Is there any other kind?" They followed him through the ship's corridors, the oppressive silence hanging like a shroud. Each step echoed ominously, the shadows lurking like specters ready to pounce. Calix couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The conference room was as inviting as a morgue. Lieutenant Firth was there, looking more like a sleep-deprived zombie than usual. His eyes flickered over them, unreadable. "Let's cut to the chase," Darrow said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We've got a problem." "Someone's feeding intel to the Ithrix." "No kidding," Lyra said, crossing her arms. "We figured that out when our system started playing peekaboo with us." Firth shifted, his expression a mask of neutrality. "The question is who, and how deep the rot goes." Calix considered the room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "You wouldn't have dragged us here unless you had an idea." Darrow's gaze was steely. "We do. But you're not going to like it." Calix braced himself. "Try me." "There's been chatter," Darrow continued, his tone flat. "Someone's been trying to get into the restricted areas, engineering life support. And all signs point to someone in your department." Calix's stomach dropped. "You're kidding." "I wish I was," Darrow replied, "but we need to know who's behind it before they do any real damage." "Great," Calix said, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "Just a little witch hunt to brighten our day." "This isn't a joke," Firth interjected, his expression grim. "If we don't handle this, we're all dead." "Then what's the plan?" Lyra asked, her voice carrying the sharp edge of frustration. "We can't go around accusing everyone." "No," Darrow agreed. "Which is why we need you to keep this under wraps. Root them out quietly." "Quietly, he says," Calix muttered. "Like anything's quiet on this floating asylum." Darrow gave him a withering look. "You two are the best we've got. Don't let us down." The meeting disbanded, leaving Calix and Lyra with a task that felt as impossible as convincing a son to take a day off. They retreated to their quarters, the weight of suspicion a newfound burden. "Any ideas how to play detective?" Lyra asked, collapsing onto her bunk. Calix shrugged, the motion heavy with fatigue. "Not really. But maybe we start by looking at who's had access to the comms." Lyra nodded, her fingers already dancing over the datapad. "I'll pull the logs. Might take a bit to filter out the junk." "Take your time," Calix said, though patience was a luxury they couldn't afford. "If we don't get this figured out soon, it won't matter anyway." They worked in silence, the ship's hum a reminder of the fragile peace they were trying to maintain. Hours slipped by, the monotony only broken by the occasional creak of the ship's old bones. Finally, Lyra sat back, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Got something." Calix leaned over, peering at the datapad. "What am I looking at?" "Access logs," Lyra explained. "Over the last few days there's been a pattern. Someone's been accessing the systems at odd hours. And not just anyone." Calix squinted at the screen. "That's Lieutenant Firth's code." "Bingo," Lyra said, her smile grim. "Looks like our monotone friend isn't as boring as he seems." Calix let the information settle, the implications clawing at his mind. "You think he's the mole?" Lyra shrugged. "Either he's got a side hustle as a Ithrix informant, or someone's using his credentials to throw us off the trail." Neither option was particularly comforting. "Suppose we confront him," Lyra snorted. "And say what?" "Hey Firth, mind telling us if you're a traitor before dessert?" Calix chuckled despite himself. "Fair point. But we can't just sit on this." "No," Lyra agreed. "But we'll need proof. Hard proof. Otherwise, it's our word against his, and I'm not betting my life on a hunch." They spent the next few hours devising a plan, weaving a web of deceit to catch their potential betrayer. It wasn't foolproof, but then nothing ever was on the Endurance. Just as they were finalizing details, the ship's lights flickered ominously, plunging them into darkness. The familiar drone of the engine stuttered, then fell silent, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. "Great," Calyx muttered in the pitch black. Because things weren't bad enough already. Lyra's voice was a wry whisper in the darkness. I'd say we hit rock bottom, but I'm pretty sure there's an express elevator to hell around here somewhere. The emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to dance with glee at their predicament. Calyx moved to the door, peering out into the corridor. We should check the control room, he said. See if this is part of their plan. Lyra nodded, and they navigated the dimly lit corridors, the oppressive silence only broken by the distant murmurs of confused crew members. Reaching the control room, they found it deserted, the consoles blinking with error messages like a Christmas tree gone wild. Calyx approached the main terminal, fingers flying over the keys. Looks like someone's having a field day with our systems, he said, frustration mounting. Think it's Firth? Lyra asked, casting a cautious eye over her shoulder. Feels like his style, Calyx replied. But I wouldn't put it past whoever's helping him to be lurking around. They worked in tandem, trying to wrestle control back from the unseen enemy. The ship groaned, the sound echoing ominously in the confined space. Got something, Lyra said suddenly, pointing to a section of code. Looks like a failsafe. We tripped this and it should kick the systems back into gear. Calyx hesitated. Should, Lyra shrugged. Nothing's certain with this mess. But it's our best shot. With a deep breath, Calyx engaged the failsafe, the ship shuddering as power hummed back to life. The lights flickered on, the engines roaring back to their usual comforting groan. Looks like we're still in business, Calyx said, relief washing over him like a cool breeze. Barely, Lyra replied, though a smile danced at the corners of her lips. But I'll take a narrow escape over the alternative any day. Their victory was short-lived. Alarms blared and the ship's comms buzzed to life with an urgent message from Captain Darrow. All crew, prepare for immediate lockdown. Security breach on Deck 3. Suspected hostile presence. Calyx met Lyra's gaze, the gravity of their situation settling like a leaden weight. Time to see if our hunch pays off. They sprinted through the corridors, the chaos of the breach adding to the already charged atmosphere. Crew members rushed past, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. As they reached Deck 3, they were greeted by a scene of pandemonium. Security officers were scattered, weapons drawn, as they tried to establish order amidst the chaos. There, Lyra whispered, nudging Calyx and pointing towards a figure ducking behind a storage unit. It was Firth, his usually impassive face twisted with concentration as he worked furiously at a panel. Calyx's heart pounded, adrenaline surging as they approached. Lieutenant Firth, Calyx called, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. Firth froze, turning slowly to face them. His eyes flickered with something Calyx couldn't quite place, fear perhaps, or maybe just the realization that his game was up. Von Halen, Firth said, his voice as monotone as ever. What a surprise. Drop the act, Lyra said, stepping forward. We know what you've been up to. Firth's gaze darted to the side, his expression tightening. I don't know what you're talking about, sure you don't, Calyx replied, crossing his arms. Because innocent men always fiddle with restricted access panels during a security breach. The cornered rat look in Firth's eyes said it all. You don't understand. They've got, save it, Calyx interrupted, his patience worn thin. You want to talk, you do it in front of Darrow. Firth hesitated, weighing his options as security closed in, their expressions grim. Fine, he sighed, raising his hands in surrender. But you're making a mistake. Join the club, Lyra muttered, gesturing for the officers to take him away. As they secured his hands, Calyx felt a strange mix of triumph and foreboding. They'd caught him, yes, but the Ithrix wouldn't be so easily deterred. This was just the beginning, and with the ship on the brink, the real fight was only just starting. Back in their quarters, the adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. Calyx collapsed onto his bunk, the events of the day replaying in his mind like a bad holo-vid. Think we got him in time? Lyra asked, her voice muffled as she lay back on her own bunk. Who knows? Calyx replied, staring at the ceiling as if it held all the answers. But we've bought ourselves a little breathing room at least. In this line of work, that's all we can ask for, Lyra said, her tone wry. Calyx chuckled, the sound echoing in the silent room. Here's hoping tomorrow's not a complete shitstorm. Their laughter faded into the quiet, leaving only the hum of the ship and the weight of the unknown. It wasn't peace, not by a long shot, but it was a start. And for now, that would have to be enough. Calyx Vaughn sat hunched over his datapad like it was a crystal ball, trying to divine some sort of sense from the chaos that had become his life. Terminal after terminal, log after log, his eyes roamed over the screen, each line of code mocking him with its bland, technical gibberish. Somewhere in this digital haystack was the needle they needed to stick it to the Ithrix. Of course, the Ithrix were probably sticking it right back at them with a smile, but hey, nobody said this was going to be easy or fun. "Any luck?" Lyra Halen asked, her voice as cheery as a funeral in the rain. "Define luck," Calyx replied, rubbing his temples. "Because if by luck you mean finding out that Firth's been watching more cat videos than I thought physically possible, then yeah, I'm swimming in it." "Guess we all have our secrets," she mused, plopping down beside him with the elegance of a sack of potatoes. "Yours just happened to involve not getting blasted into molecules. Everyone's gotta have a hobby," Calyx said. "Firth's is treason, apparently. Speaking of which, I've been thinking." Lyra rolled her eyes. "Oh boy, here we go." "No, seriously," Calyx insisted, waving a hand at the datapad. "What if there's a way to turn the Ithrix's empathy weapon against them?" "Empathy as a weapon," she said, shaking her head. "You'd think being in space would save us from touchy-feely crap, but no, it's like a therapy session that can kill you. I'm serious, though. Their whole SH stick is manipulating emotions, right? What if we could reverse it? Make them feel all the crap they're throwing at us?" "Interesting theory," Lyra conceded. "But how?" Calyx tapped a few keys, pulling up the schematics of the comms system. "Let's assume their waves have a specific frequency. If we can find it, maybe we can broadcast something that scrambles it, like emotional static." Lyra's eyebrows shot up. "You're talking about creating an emotional jamming signal." "Exactly. We could blast a wave of pure human misery back at them. If they're as empathetic as they claim, maybe they'll think twice before messing with us again." Lyra grinned, a wicked glint in her eye. "Nothing like a little taste of their own medicine. Let's do it." "First, we need to rally the troops," Calyx said, rising to his feet. "We can't do this alone. We need a team, crew members who haven't gone off the deep end." She nodded, a determined set to her jaw. "Leave that to me. I've got a short list of people I trust more than a Ithrix with my emotions. And that's a short list, I assume. Shorter than my patience with this whole mess," she quipped. With a plan forming, Calyx and Lyra set off to gather their motley crew. The corridors of the Endurance were still in chaos, but there was a method to the madness if you squinted hard enough, or maybe you just had to be a little mad yourself. Either way, they had work to do. Their first stop was a small storage bay where they found Zeke Maddox, a mechanic with a penchant for creative swearing, tinkering with a busted drone. "Hey Zeke," Lyra called, leaning against the doorway like she owned the place. Zeke looked up, wiping grease-stained hands on his coveralls. "What's up, Doc?" "Come to see if I've finally blown myself up." "Not today," she replied with a smirk. "We've got a proposition. How'd you like to stick it to the Ithrix?" Zeke's eyes lit up. "About time someone asked. Those slimy bastards have been messing with my engines." Calyx explained the plan, outlining how they needed some technical expertise to make their emotional jammer work. Zeke listened intently, nodding along with a grin that spread wider with each word. "You had me at blast those bastards," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Count me in." "One down," Lyra said as they left Zeke to his tools. "Now for the tricky part, finding someone not liable to stab us in our sleep." They made their way to the infirmary, hoping to find someone relatively sane. The medical bay was one of the few places on the ship that looked like it had seen less action than a pacifist in a bar fight. They found Riley Cade, the ship's medic, elbow-deep in supplies. "Riley," Calyx greeted, nodding towards the overworked medic. "Got a minute?" Depends, Riley said, not looking up from her task. Am I going to regret listening? Probably, Lyra admitted, but we need your help. We're planning to give the Ithrix a taste of their own emotional warfare, and we could use someone who knows their way around a brain wave. Riley finally glanced up, interest piqued. You're serious? Dead serious, Calyx replied. Figured you might want in on the action. Riley set down her work, a contemplative look on her face. I'm in, but if this goes south, I'm blaming you too. Fair enough, Lyra said with a grin. Now with Riley and Zeke on board, the team was beginning to take shape. As they continued gathering allies, Calyx couldn't shake the feeling that they were putting together the most ragtag band of rebels the universe had never asked for. The next recruit was Ethan Cross, a former tech specialist turned reluctant ship's janitor thanks to a particularly unlucky poker game. They found him mopping up a spill in the mess hall. Ethan, Calyx called out, wincing slightly at the smell of whatever today's mystery meat was. Hey Calyx, Ethan replied, leaning on his mop. What's cooking, besides the usual culinary atrocities? We're planning a little counteroffensive, Lyra said, cutting to the chase. Care to trade your mop for a mouse? Ethan's face lit up like a kid on Christmas. Damn straight. I didn't join this crew to play janitor. What's the plan? They explained the idea, and Ethan nodded along, his mind already racing ahead of them. His knack for multitasking would be useful in creating the emotional jamming signal they needed. Count me in, he said. I've been dying for something interesting to do. Welcome to the club, Calyx said dryly. With their team assembled, the small group gathered in a secluded area of the cargo bay, away from prying eyes and ears. The room was cramped, the cold metal walls closing in around them, but it would have to do. All right, Calyx said, addressing the group. Here's the deal. We think we can turn the Ithrix's weapon against them by broadcasting an emotional jamming signal. We've got the brains, the tech, and the determination to make this work. But we need to act fast before they figure out what we're up to. Zeke nodded, a mischievous glint in his eye. Just point me to whatever you need me to break or fix, and I'll get it done. Riley glanced at the datapad, her focus sharp. I can help with the medical aspect. If we're dealing with brain waves, we need to make sure we don't fry our own circuits in the process. Ethan rubbed his hands together, a wicked grin on his face. Let me at the comms system. I'll have those Ithrix feeling like they're trapped in a bad breakup montage in no time. Lyra crossed her arms, looking around at their motley crew. This is it, guys. Let's make our own luck. With everyone on board, they split off into pairs, each group tackling a different aspect of the plan. Calyx worked with Ethan to modify the comms system, their fingers flying over the controls as they adjusted frequencies and rerouted signals. How's it looking? Calyx asked, glancing at Ethan. Like a disaster waiting to happen, Ethan replied, not missing a beat. But in a good way. Meanwhile, Lyra and Riley focused on the medical end of the operation, their heads bent over a tangled mess of wires and sensors. This is going to work, Lyra said, more to herself than anyone else. Damn right it is, Riley replied. We're not letting those Ithrix bastards get the last word. As the Iors ticked by, the ship's usual hum was punctuated by the occasional bang or curse from Zeke's corner, where he was busy making sure everything was wired up correctly. Or at least, in a way that wouldn't blow them all to kingdom come. Despite the weight of their task, there was a strange camaraderie among them, a shared understanding that they were all in this together. It was a feeling Calyx hadn't experienced in a long time, like they were more than just cogs in the Endurance's ancient machinery. They were a team, maybe even friends. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pieces began to fall into place. The jamming signal was ready, and all they needed was the right moment to deploy it. Calyx gathered the team one last time, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the holographic display. This is it. We're as ready as we'll ever be. Are we sure this is going to work? Ethan asked, his usual bravado tinged with a hint of apprehension. No, Calyx admitted. But when has anything ever been sure in this line of work? Point taken, Ethan said with a wry grin. As they prepared to launch their counterattack, the ship's comms crackled to life with a panicked message. All crew to battle stations. Ithric's forces approaching. Looks like we're out of time, Lyra said, her gaze meeting Calyx's. Then let's give them hell, Calyx replied. The team sprang into action, each of them knowing exactly what needed to be done. As the Endurance braced for another encounter with the Ithrics, Calyx felt a surge of determination. They might be outgunned and outnumbered, but they had something the Ithrics didn't, a plan so crazy it just might work. Activate the jammer, Calyx ordered, his voice steady. Ethan nodded, his fingers flying over the controls. Here goes nothing. As the signal went live, a ripple of static energy coursed through the ship, and Calyx could only hope it would be enough to turn the tide in their favor. It was a desperate gamble, but in that moment, he wouldn't have had it any other way. The Endurance shuddered as the emotional jammer sprang to life, its signal crackling through the air like a bad hangover. Calyx stood at the helm of their ad hoc control center, a control center that looked suspiciously like a pile of junk held together by zip ties and wishful thinking. But it was their pile of junk, and it was about to save their skins. Did it work? Riley asked, peering over a console with the kind of focus usually reserved for people defusing bombs or trying to enjoy a vegan burger. Calyx shrugged, trying to look nonchalant while secretly sweating bullets. Hard to say. The Ithrics have the emotional fortitude of a toddler on a sugar high. But if the tech gods are smiling on us, they should be feeling like they've just watched the saddest puppy video imaginable. If not, Ethan piped up, we're about to get a front row seat to our own funeral. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Lyra quipped. She was a picture of manic energy, juggling datapads and cables like a circus act. If there was one thing she was good at, it was making chaos look intentional. The comms suddenly buzzed to life with Lieutenant Firth's droning voice. Captain Darrow requests a status update. He expects results or a resignation letter from all of you. And maybe a cup of coffee, Calyx muttered under his breath. Tell him we're working on it, Firth. Affirmative. Though I wouldn't hold my breath, Firth replied, as optimistic as an undertaker at a flu convention. As the team returned to their stations, the Endurance lurched again, the Ithric ships looming closer on the holographic display. They were like a menacing swarm of space locusts, dead set on making everyone aboard the Endurance feel like the universe's least wanted party guests. All right, Calyx said, squaring his shoulders as if that would somehow make the ship's walls soundproof. Time to hit them with everything we've got. Lyra raised an eyebrow, which, in our case, amounts to hope and sarcasm. Don't forget dumb luck, Zeke added, adjusting a tangle of wires that probably shouldn't have been under his feet. Plenty of that going around. Ethan was busy at the comms, grinning like a kid in a candy store. Let's see how they like this playlist of human misery. I've got everything from breakup ballads to existential dread on shuffle. The Ithric ships drew closer, their presence like a creeping sense of doom. Calyx imagined they were probably having a grand old time, picturing the humans squirming. Well, joke's on them. Initiate the signal, Calyx commanded. Ethan obliged, his fingers dancing over the controls with the precision of a concert pianist. The console hummed in response, the carefully crafted emotional jamming signal spreading out like a digital storm cloud. The team held their collective breath. For a heartbeat, everything was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that suggests something has either gone very wrong or is about to. Then the alien ships visibly wavered on the display, their formations breaking like poorly glued models. Look at that, Riley said, an incredulous smile spreading across her face. They're backing off. Lyra punched the air. I knew my psychological shield would work. Those emotional bullies are getting a taste of their own medicine. Calyx couldn't help but chuckle. Never underestimate the power of a good old-fashioned guilt trip. The Ithric ships were clearly struggling. They faltered in their advance, their previously unshakable formation now more like a drunkard's meandering stagger. The Endurance might not have had the firepower, but it had something far more potent: human determination and the universal language of emotional breakdowns. Riley turned to Calyx, her expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "I think we actually did it." "Don't sound so surprised," Calyx said, crossing his arms with mock bravado. "We had a plan, sort of." The ship's comm system crackled again, this time with the gruff voice of Captain Darrow, who was not known for his patience. "What the hell just happened, Vaughn?" Calyx grinned into the comm, feeling rather like a cat who'd swallowed a particularly smug canary. "Just a little emotional warfare, Captain. Turns out the Ithrix couldn't handle the heat." Darrow's pause spoke volumes, probably about 5 encyclopedias worth of disbelief. "Well, don't just stand there patting yourselves on the back. We've got to capitalize on this before they regroup." "On it," Calyx replied, cutting the connection with a flourish. He turned back to the team, who were already looking for the next set of instructions. Ethan was grinning ear to ear. "Now what? Do we ask them if they want to join our next therapy session?" Calyx could only shake his head. "Let's not push our luck. We need to keep up the signal and make sure they stay off balance. If we can make them retreat, it buys us time to get the hell out of here." Zeke was already on it, moving with the kind of speed that suggested he'd been through more than his fair share of barroom brawls. "Leave it to me. I'll keep this rig from blowing up while we make a run for it." As the team continued to work like a well-oiled, if slightly dysfunctional machine, the ship's alarms blared a warning. The Ithrix were regrouping, and this time they were bringing friends. "Looks like they're calling in reinforcements," Lyra said, checking the increasing blips on the radar. "Guess they don't like losing." "No one does," Calyx replied, feeling the pressure start to mount. "We need to make sure our signal stays strong enough to keep them at bay." Riley studied the display, her brow furrowed. "If we can maintain the signal and boost its range, we might just overwhelm their systems entirely, make them question their life choices." Calyx nodded. "Let's make it happen then. Ethan, can you boost the signal strength without blowing out what's left of our systems?" Ethan looked at Calyx as if he'd just asked him to perform a magic trick while juggling chainsaws. "With a bit of creativity and a lot of swearing, sure." "Good. Let's see if we can send them running with their tails between their legs," Calyx said. The team worked with the kind of feverish intensity usually reserved for last-minute tax returns. Sweat trickled down foreheads, and the air was thick with a cocktail of tension and determination. If the Ithrix couldn't handle their first blast, this boosted signal would have them running for cover. Ethan, true to his word, managed to coax more power from the system. The Endurance shuddered again, not from enemy fire but from the sheer audacity of their plan. "Here goes everything," Ethan announced, adjusting the controls with a flourish. The signal pulsed, stronger and more insistent, and the alien ships wavered again. This time, there was a noticeable ripple effect across the fleet. Ships that had been holding steady suddenly veered off course, bumping into each other like a bunch of drunken bumper cars. Lyra laughed, a sound that was equal parts triumph and disbelief. "They're falling apart. More like having a collective existential crisis," Riley said, clearly enjoying the show. Calyx felt a surge of pride in his ragtag crew. They'd managed to outwit a technologically superior enemy with nothing more than ingenuity and a stubborn refusal to give in. It was the kind of victory that made him almost believe in happy endings. Almost. The Ithrix ships began to retreat, their once coordinated assault now a disorganized scramble for safety. It was as if they had suddenly realized invading a human ship with nothing to lose was a bad idea. Who knew weaponized ennui could be so effective? Captain Darrow's voice cut through the celebratory mood, still gruff but with a hint of grudging admiration. "Impressive work, Vaughn. Now get us the hell out of here before they change their minds." Calyx gave a mock salute to the comms. "Aye, Captain." Already on it. With the Ithrix in retreat, the Endurance's engines roared to life and the ship lurched forward, leaving the mess of confused aliens in their wake. The crew's relief was palpable. They had snatched victory from the jaws of what had felt like certain defeat. As the ship raced away from the scene, Lyra leaned back in her chair, exhaustion catching up with her. "I can't believe we did it." "Believe it," Calyx said, a smile tugging at his lips. "We may be the unlikeliest crew in the universe, but damned if we didn't pull it off." The room was filled with the sound of weary laughter, the kind that comes after narrowly escaping death by a hair's breadth. They were alive, they were free, and most importantly, they had managed to outwit the Ithrix using their own game. Riley clapped Calyx on the shoulder. "Guess you're not just a pretty face after all," he chuckled, a mix of relief and disbelief still coursing through him. "And you're not just a medic with a penchant for sarcasm. Hell of a team we've got here." As the Endurance sped away from their once certain doom, the crew exchanged tired smiles. Despite the odds, they had survived. They had outsmarted an enemy better equipped and more experienced. With a little luck, a lot of cleverness, and a surprising amount of human spirit, they'd turned the tide. Now, as they slipped into the vastness of space, the crew of the Endurance had one last victory to savor. The knowledge that they had faced down the Ithrix and against all odds had come out on top. Not bad for a day's work. The Endurance drifted through space like a bruised and battered prizefighter after a particularly brutal match. The recent skirmish had left it looking more like a floating junkyard than a ship. Calyx stood at the helm, staring at the flickering holographic display with something akin to pride. Lyra sidled up to him, still juggling a datapad and a mass of tangled cables like some deranged circus performer. "Well, that was fun," she said, grinning like a madwoman. "Who knew emotional warfare could be so invigorating?" "Invigorating isn't the word I'd use," Calyx replied, scanning through the data with a frown. "More like exhausting, but hey, whatever floats your space kayak." Lyra chuckled, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "We've really put the Ithrix through an emotional ringer, haven't we?" "Serves them right," Calyx said, tapping a few commands into the console. "Emotionally manipulating us like we're their personal stress balls." The atmosphere on the bridge was one of cautious optimism. It was the kind of feeling you get after barely scraping through a final exam you hadn't studied for. Ethan was still at the comms, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like the soundtrack to a horror movie. His fingers danced over the controls as if they'd sprouted a life of their own. "Hey," Ethan called over his shoulder, "anyone want to hear the latest breakup anthem from the Ithrix top charts? I hear it's a real tearjerker." "Pass," Lyra said dryly. "I've had enough emotional upheaval for one day." Calyx shook his head, suppressing a laugh. "Let's save the sob stories for later. We've still got work to do." Zeke, having wrestled a particularly stubborn piece of machinery into submission, wiped his greasy hands on his trousers. "You know," he said, looking around the bridge with a smug grin, "I reckon we've earned ourselves a nice, long break." Captain Darrow's voice crackled over the comms, sounding as gruff as ever, but with a hint of warmth that could almost be mistaken for approval. "Good work, crew, but don't get too comfortable. We've got repairs to make and systems to overhaul." "We're not out of the woods yet." "Right," Calyx said, nodding even though Darrow couldn't see him. "Let's get to it then." The aftermath of the battle was a symphony of organized chaos. Crew members scurried about, patching up the ship as best they could while exchanging stories of near misses and victories. The Endurance's corridors buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from narrowly avoiding disaster. Riley, ever the stoic, approached Calyx with her usual level-headedness. "We've got to prioritize the emotional jammer's maintenance," she said, her voice even despite the chaos around them. "If the Ithrix decide to double back, we need to be ready." "Yeah, you're right," Calyx agreed. "Let's keep the momentum going. The last thing we need is a repeat performance of their power ballad from hell." Lyra, who had been scribbling notes on her datapad like a woman possessed, interjected with a newfound enthusiasm. "You know, with some tweaks, we could probably improve the jammer's efficiency by at least 20%. "Eager to poke the bear again, are we?" Calyx asked, raising an eyebrow. "Always," Lyra replied with a gleam in her eye. Besides, I think it's high time someone taught the Ithrix a lesson in human resilience. Calyx nodded, feeling a surge of camaraderie. All right, let's show them what we're made of. The crew set to work, each member diving into their tasks with renewed vigor. For all the chaos and uncertainty that had plagued them, there was an undeniable sense of purpose in the air. As the Endurance's systems were slowly brought back to life, Calyx and Lyra took a moment to catch their breath in the cramped conference room. It was still as uninviting as ever, but at least it was a familiar kind of uncomfortable. "So," Lyra said, sinking into a chair that creaked ominously under her weight, "what do you think the Ithrix are doing right now?" Calyx shrugged, leaning back with a sigh. "Probably having a group therapy session. Why don't the humans like us? How can we better manipulate their emotions without them fighting back?" Lyra snorted. "If only they knew how stubborn we are. It's like trying to herd cats through a laser field." "Or teaching a rock to swim," Calyx added with a chuckle. "But hey, that's what makes us human." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the kind that only comes after facing an impossible challenge and coming out on top. The weight of their recent victory hung in the air, a reminder of the strength they had found in each other. "You know," Lyra said, breaking the silence, "for all the trouble we've been through, I'm kind of proud of what we've accomplished." "Yeah," Calyx agreed, staring at the ceiling as if he could see straight through it to the stars beyond. "We may not be the most conventional crew, but we got the job done." Lyra grinned, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Maybe there's hope for us yet." The ship hummed with a low, steady rhythm as repairs continued around them. The glow of the holographic display flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room. "Speaking of hope," Calyx said, sitting up with renewed determination, "we should probably check on the rest of the crew. Make sure everyone's holding up okay." Lyra nodded, rising to her feet with the kind of energy that suggested she could keep going for hours if she had to. "Right. Can't have anyone wallowing in existential dread on our watch." They made their way through the corridors, exchanging nods and words of encouragement with the crew members they passed. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of camaraderie that couldn't be shaken. Ethan was in the mess hall, navigating a meal that looked like it had been cooked by someone with a vendetta against taste buds. "Hey, Calyx, Lyra," he called out, waving a spoon that dripped with a substance best left unidentified. "Care for some mystery mush?" "I'm good," Calyx replied, eyeing the meal with skepticism. "I think I'll stick to the emotions buffet we've been running." "Suit yourself," Ethan said with a shrug. "More for me." As they moved on, Calyx couldn't help but feel a twinge of pride at how the crew had come together. Despite the odds, they'd managed to not only survive but thrive in the face of adversity. It was a testament to their resilience and adaptability, traits that made humanity such a formidable force. Riley was in the engine room, her gaze focused on a particularly stubborn piece of machinery. "You two done congratulating yourselves?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "For now," Lyra replied, smirking. "But if you want to join in, feel free. There's plenty of back padding to go around." Riley rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "I'll pass. Still got a ship to fix, remember." "You're a killjoy as always," Calyx said, clapping Riley on the shoulder. "But I appreciate it. We'd be lost without you." Yeah, Riley muttered, clearly trying to hide her amusement. "Now get out of here before I start charging you for standing around." As they continued their rounds, Calyx couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something bigger than themselves. They'd faced down an enemy that had seemed insurmountable, and though the battle had taken its toll, they'd come out stronger for it. The Ithrix, with all their emotional manipulation and superior technology, had underestimated the one thing humans excelled at: surviving against all odds. It was a lesson that Calyx hoped they'd take to heart, though he doubted they'd learn it without a few more bruises along the way. As they returned to the bridge, the crew was once again bustling with activity. Repairs were in full swing, and there was an air of determination that was almost palpable. "All right, folks," Calyx announced, clapping his hands together. "Let's keep this momentum going. We've got a ship to mend and a lot of emotional scars to heal." "Don't forget about the emotional scars," Ethan chimed in, ever the opportunist. "I've got some great tunes lined up for that." "Save it for the victory party," Lyra said, settling back into her seat with a satisfied smile. "We've earned at least that much." As the Endurance continued its journey through the stars, Calyx couldn't help but reflect on the trials they'd faced and the victories they'd claimed. They were a motley crew, to be sure, but they were his crew. And as long as they were together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. It was a comforting thought, one that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. For now, though, they had a moment to breathe, to heal, and to rebuild. The Ithrix might have their empathy weapons and their psychological games, but the crew of the Endurance had something far stronger. They had each other.